seated. Open up to Habakkuk. Habakkuk. We're going to pick up tonight in our study here in Habakkuk chapter 2, and we're going to be in verse 5. A lot of times in the minor prophets, the chapter breaks come kind of in the middle of a thought, and so we just continued last week until verse 4. Tonight we pick up in verse 5. Habakkuk lives in the last days of the kingdom of Judah, which is the southern kingdom, the two tribes in the south. They have Jerusalem, and the northern kingdom of Israel has already been swallowed up by the Assyrians sometime earlier in 722 BC. And Habakkuk is burdened by the corruption that abounds in his nation. And in chapter 1, the first portion of the chapter, he lays out the things that are wrong with his nation. Again, there are many, many parallels between Habakkuk and what we see all around us. We see corruption in high places. We see the justice system twisted for personal gain. When justice is applied, it's applied unevenly. There's violence everywhere. He mentions that twice in the first chapter. He cries out to the Lord in chapter 1, and if I were to just paraphrase and kind of encapsulate his words, he'd say, Lord, how can you let all of this happen and not do anything? And sometimes we feel that same way. Sometimes we look at what's going on. We say, Lord, I know the Bible tells us that the God of Jacob neither slumbers nor sleeps. So how is it that you're missing what's going on down here? It's getting worse. It's getting worse and worse. We look at America. America, certainly, we're running off the rails. We look at what's going on in Europe. We look at what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. And there's a mess. But God tells Habakkuk in chapter 1 that judgment is coming. He tells him it's coming in the form of the Chaldean army. The Chaldeans, another name for the Babylonians. The Babylonians are coming, and they're going to leave a swath of death and destruction in their wake, because that's what they did. The Babylonians, when they came in, they just started indiscriminately killing, again, in barbaric ways. They would just kill everybody until finally there was an absolute and total unconditional surrender by that people. Then they would take all that were left of whatever that people group was. They'd herd them together. They'd kill a good portion of them. And then they would take whatever was left and they would transport them to another location, which is what they did in the case of Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were taken to another place. And Habakkuk is horrified. Lord, I understand that we're bad, and I know I've been complaining, but Lord, surely you're not going to use the Babylonians, the Chaldeans. They're worse than we are. We made the observation last week that the Babylonians were truly an idolatrous nation, but in their defense, they didn't have the truth. Judah was also an idolatrous nation. And they were sinning against the truth. They were sinning against the word of God's prophets. They were sinning against the law of Moses that they had been given. They were sinning against the testimony of David and Solomon. The people of Judah had made a deliberate choice to turn their backs on centuries of truth, the message of the prophets, the goodness of God, and they also descend into idolatry. But Habakkuk saw the Babylonians as worse than the people of Judah because of their barbaric actions. When, in reality, the Babylonians are heathens without the truth of God, and the people of Judah are heathens with the truth of God. Which is worse? It's worse to sin against truth, right? The Bible says that to whom much is given, much is required. And that's exactly what's going on. In chapter 2, verse 1, Habakkuk awaits God's answer, and God tells Habakkuk that the judgment is imminent. He says in verse 2, write the vision, make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. Again, the idea of a billboard. Habakkuk, I want you to write this down. I want you to write it in letters big enough that somebody who's running past can read it clearly. This is what's going to happen, and God's going to lay it out for him. The Babylonians are going to be arriving soon. We believe that Habakkuk ministered in the end or during the reign of Jehoiakim, which if you read in Daniel, you read that during the reign of Jehoiakim, the Babylonians came. Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged Jerusalem. Yet in the midst of the destruction that's coming, God will preserve a remnant of the faithful. Look at verse 4. He says, behold, his soul which is lifted up is not right in him, but the just shall live by his faith. This is quoted 3 different times in the New Testament, that phrase, the just shall live by faith, in Romans and in Galatians and also in Hebrews. For centuries, Judah had continued in her sin, mistaking the mercy and long-suffering of God for apathy and laxity. It's easy to fall into that trap today, isn't it? We see God, we serve a long-suffering God, don't we? We serve a merciful and gracious God. And many times it's easy. We do something that we know to be wrong, and when God doesn't send a lightning bolt out of heaven and strike us down where we stand, we think, well, God's not really paying attention to me. No, we serve a good, a gracious, and a long-suffering God, but we shouldn't mistake his long-suffering and his mercy and his grace for laxity and apathy. Does God care when we do wrong? Did God care for Judah? Absolutely he does. God was sending the Babylonians as instruments of his judgment. But the Babylonians sinned as if there was no judgment as well. Judah lived as if there was no tomorrow. They lived as though they would never give an account. So did Babylon. And so we come to where we pick up tonight, God's opinion of Babylon. Look at verse 5 of chapter 2. God's opinion of Babylon. Yea, also, because he, speaking of Babylon, kind of making it one person, yea, also, because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man. Neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. God is going to use Babylon as an instrument of judgment upon his people, but he's also keeping a record of their offenses. God wasn't playing favorites. He wasn't applying his justice unevenly, as was Habakkuk's gripe against the people of Judah, the people in charge of Judah. God is going to judge Judah with Babylon. God is going to judge Babylon with Media and Persia. And then God is going to judge Media and Persia with Greece. And so it just continues on down. God uses nations to judge other nations. And that's exactly what's going on. He's keeping record of their offenses. It says he transgresseth by wine. Babylon was famous and known for their drunken orgies and parties. If you were to look back at Daniel chapter 5, the king Belshazzar, he wasn't really the king. He was a sit-in for the sit-in. His dad was actually the guy who was in charge, and so it's kind of a messed up situation. But Belshazzar threw a big feast, and he called for the instruments that had been used in the temple of Jehovah in Jerusalem, and they had a drunken party, and they were drinking out of the sacred objects that had been used in the worship of Jehovah. You remember that's the night that there was a hand that came and wrote on the wall, and it said, "You've been weighed in the balance and found wanting, and your kingdom's going to be taken and given to the Medes and the Persians." And it was that night. As that party was going on, the Medes and the Persians had rerouted a river around the town and had entered, and they were starting in from the outskirts. And so Babylon is known for these drunken parties, just everything that went on here. Babylon's appetite for conquest is insatiable. You look there, it says, he's a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 15 says, "There are 3 things that are never satisfied. Yea, 4 things, say not, it is enough. The grave, the barren womb, the earth that is not filled with water, and fire that saith not, it is enough." Just as there's never a point, if you set, when you burn off your field, and you set fire on one spot and the fire's going across, it doesn't go halfway across when there's still fuel in front of it and say, "No, I'm good. I've had enough." It's going to go till it runs out of fuel. And the Babylonians live by that same motto. They just keep going. They have an insatiable appetite. Their neighbors aren't safe. They just keep coming in from the outskirts and drawing in more to their kingdom. Like the fires of hell, they couldn't get enough of the war and conquest that continually spread their borders even wider. As we've mentioned, the Babylonian armies were especially noted for their brutality to those who they conquered. The things that they did to prisoners of war especially, just hideous. hideous things. Look at verse 6. It says, "Shall not all these take up a parable against him, and a taunting proverb," or a taunt song, you could say. A taunt. We're going to make up a song against the Babylonians, is essentially what God is saying. "Shall not all these take up a parable against him, and a taunting proverb against him, and say..." And now if you'll look here, this chapter very easily breaks itself down. If you'll look, God is going to declare 5 woes upon the Babylonians. If you'll look at verse 6, you'll see in the middle of the verse, you'll see woe. If you go to verse 9, verse 12, verse 15, and verse 19, there are 5 different times God says, woe because of this, and this, and this. 5 different times. And so this chapter breaks itself down very easily into an understandable way. We're going to look at some of these woes here this evening. Habakkuk was concerned that God could use a people more wicked than Judah to judge them. And so God explains that judgment is coming for Babylon. God will judge nations and God will judge individuals who involve themselves in, verse 9, the first woe. Verse 6, halfway through the verse, "Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. How long? And to him that ladeth himself with thick clay, shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee? And awake that shall vex thee? And shalt thou be for booties unto them? Because thou hast spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil thee, because of men's blood, and for the violence of the land, of the city, and of all that dwell therein." If we had to encapsulate this first woe, we would probably call it greed and theft. Everything they saw, they wanted. What do you say of a king who has an army? When he wants something, how does he get it? He sends in his army and he says, "This is mine now. And if you want it, you got to fight for it." And nobody was able to stand up against the armies of Nebuchadnezzar. It says, "Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his," is a elongated way of saying somebody who takes what doesn't belong to them. "He that ladeth himself with thick clay." This has the idea of taking pledges. Or this word, when it says with thick clay, ladeth himself with thick clay, if you look at the Hebrew, it has the idea of one who goes on an abundance of credit. Okay, that's what this idea here is. And the next word that we'll look at here, it says, "Shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee?" That word bite means to sting suddenly or to oppress with interest on a loan. The nation of Babylon, the empire of Babylon, was extending their credit. They were increasing their debt. Does any of this sound familiar? Okay, a little bit. That's what Babylon's doing. And God says that's going to come back to bite you. Literally, that's going to come back and it's going to get you. The creditors will descend quickly to exact the loans and interest that has been taken out. Verse 8 points out that just as Babylon had an insatiable appetite for conquest of many nations, Babylon's downfall would be hastened on by many nations who would see Babylon's destruction as a way to enhance themselves. What happens when nations start to go down the tubes? Well, all of their neighbors start trying to decide how to divvy up the spoils of that nation. That is, we look at what's going on in Russia and the Ukraine. And it's terrible what we see, the loss of human life. But that has been the story of humans for as long as there have been humans. After the Garden of Eden, mankind started having issue with one another. Cain killed Abel. And the story of human history has been one of conquest, where if a nation needs oil or if a nation needs iron, what do? Well, they go find a nation that has oil or iron and they take it over. That's how it works. That's what Babylon was doing, but at the same time they were overextending themselves. And God says, look, that's going to come back and bite you one day. One day, all of the people who hold your debt are going to come back. They're going to bite. They're going to oppress with interest. Again, the similarities are eerily familiar as we look at what's going on in the United States. Let's look at the second woe, verse 9. Woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of evil. Thou hast consulted shame to thy house by cutting off many people, and hast sinned against thy soul. For the stone shall cry out of the wall, and the beam out of the timber shall answer it. This woe goes hand in glove with the first woe. Covetousness and theft are very closely related. You don't usually find people stealing what they don't want, do you? Okay? When I go to the grocery store, even as a child, the eggplant, the asparagus was always safe. I had no interest in taking it. I'm not taking that. But when you're little and you see the candy and you think, I really want some, right? There's the temptation. But how does theft start? It starts right here, and it starts as covetousness. It starts as a thought process, as does all sin. This covetousness and this theft, they're closely related. Babylon had used their ill-gotten gain from the first woe, what they had stolen from others, they used to place themselves in a position where they felt untouchable. Verse 9, he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of evil. Well, you can't get at Nebuchadnezzar because you have to go through his armies to get there. He's in a place where he's invincible. At least that's what they thought. But Babylon had stepped on an awful lot of people to climb her ladder of success. Verse 11 tells us that the very structures of their buildings were built using stolen material. Even their rocks, their beams and timbers are calling out at the injustice of how the Babylonians have built their empire. They've done so unjustly. They've done so with blood. They've done so with theft. They've done so with conquest. And God's not okay with it. He gives the third woe in verse 12. Woe to him that buildeth a town with blood, establisheth a city by iniquity. Behold, it is not of the Lord of hosts that the people shall labor in the very fire, and the people shall weary themselves for very vanity. For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The expansion of the Babylonian Empire was greased with the blood of the people they conquered. It is interesting. Look at verse 12. Okay, do you see what God's woe to the Babylon? This is to the Babylonians. This is God's words. He says, woe to him that buildeth a town with blood and establisheth a city by iniquity. God's talking to the Babylonians here in Habakkuk 2:12. Listen to Micah 3:10. This is God talking to his people in Judah, and he says, they build up Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. Again, look here at verse 3. Woe to him that buildeth a town with blood and establisheth a city by iniquity. So God is meting out equal justice. The people of Judah have done exactly what the people of Babylon are doing. God is going to judge Babylon just as he will judge Judah. God is using bloodthirsty people to judge his chosen bloodthirsty people. People of Judah are going to come under his judgment just as well. Verse 13 speaks of the futility of building a nation on these principles. The people shall labor in the very fire, and the people shall weary themselves for very vanity. All the accomplishments would ultimately be discovered to be vain or empty. When we read vanity in the Old Testament, it's referring to emptiness. When Solomon says vanity of vanities, all is vanity, he could just as easily be saying emptiness of emptiness, all is empty. He's looking at the world and what's going on. And here he says, look, the people of the empire of Babylon, they're working for emptiness. They're spending their time to live the Babylonian dream. Whatever that was. In their case, conquest, expanding of the empire. But all of their accomplishments, from the very highest person to the very lowest person, would be discovered to be empty and perishable. Verse 14, God gives a peek of a different kingdom, though. Look at it. He's obviously not talking about Babylon. Here is he. If you look at verse 14, it says, "For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the water covers the sea." What's he talking about? When is the time? Well, let me ask it this way, and it's a trick question, so I'm warning you ahead of time. When in human history has there been a time when the knowledge of the glory of God has covered the earth like the water covers the sea?
That's to come.
It hasn't happened yet. It's still prophetic. Habakkuk was looking ahead at what was about to happen with the Babylonians. And here in verse 14, he's looking way ahead to still future for us, still prophetic even to us. Numbers chapter 14, verse 21 says, "But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord." One day, all people will know. And it will be a time when Jesus is here on earth and he's ruling and reigning in physical form in Jerusalem. It's going to be something when following his second coming. He's talking about the millennial kingdom. Think of the contrast here. We've got Babylon. How far is Babylon from the kingdom of Christ? Well, it's a long way. In years and also in just the way that the kingdoms operate. Nebuchadnezzar rules with a rod of iron, but he rules unfaithfully. He rules according to the flesh. One day, Jesus is going to rule with a rod of iron, but he'll rule with equity. Now, as we've read over this, we're going to stop here with the woes for this evening. But what's the application to us from these verses? These woes upon Babylon, because the temptation to bloody conquest is not one that besets most 21st century Christians. If it is, we should talk very seriously at a later time. That's not usually something that we struggle with. We don't struggle with the temptation to go to our neighbor's house and butcher his family and take all of his stuff. That's not something. So what is the application? We could talk at length tonight. Is there a national application? Should we learn from history as a nation? Should the United States learn from history, from all of the nations before us who have extended their credit beyond their ability to pay? Yeah, it would make good sense, because those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And so it would make good sense, but the Bible says in Proverbs 22, verse 7, "The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender." It's true of nations, and it's true of individuals. But I don't think that's the primary focus and the primary application that we need, because, once again, none of us are in government. None of us have the ability, beyond our votes and what we can do in a civil way, we don't have the ability to change national policy. But what can we do to change ourselves? Because that's what we need to do. What is the application to us here from Habakkuk? One of the reasons for God's judgment upon Babylon was their insatiable appetite for more and more stuff. Now, they wanted empires. They wanted water rights. They wanted the things that empires want. But in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 5, Paul described a false teacher to young Timothy as a man who taught perverse disputings of men of corrupt minds, destitute of the truth, supposing that gain is godliness. From such withdraw thyself. A false teacher is one who appeals to your materialism, who appeals to the covetous nature that each and every one of us has. It gets forgotten a lot. When we're listing the 10 Commandments, we remember, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Don't kill. That's one of the big ones. If you walked up to somebody on the street, you said, "Hey, do you know one of the 10 Commandments?" They say, "Yeah, thou shalt not kill." Or, "Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery." But the 10th commandment often gets left out, which is, "Thou shalt not covet." One of God's big 10 for life is don't covet. Again, we don't struggle with the temptation to bloody conquest, but we certainly have a tendency to covetousness. Every one of us has a tendency to materialism, a tendency to elevate the things of this world, to elevate the material things to elevate the money and the stuff money can buy and to give it a place that's not its own, to push God off of his throne and place material in his place. Jesus warned in Luke chapter 12, verse 5, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth." But how many people live in America who would say that a man's life does consist of the abundance of things he possesseth? Lots. You've heard the phrase, "He who dies with the most toys wins." But it's not true. It's not true. He who dies with the most toys is still dead. But who does win? If it's not connected to your stuff, if it's not connected to, they don't print your net worth in your obituary, do they? Not usually. You have to have lots of money before they start doing that. But they don't usually print your net worth in your obituary. It's not all about our stuff, because Mark chapter 8, verse 36, "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" What's the most important thing? It's not your wallet. It's not your 401k. It's not your investments. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. Money's good. The Bible talks about it in a good light quite a bit. There's lots of good things that you can do with money. But if you're living for money, if you're living for material gain and for the stuff that you can buy with your material gain, it's not about the accumulation of more stuff. It's about a personal relationship with the maker of the universe. That's what God wanted his people to have. Judah ran off the tracks as a society. They, under Solomon was the first one, then they really ran off after them when the kingdom divided. It got much worse. But what happened is they got comfortable, they got distracted, and they got all caught up in what they could make of themselves, rather than their relationship with God. Now, in Judah particularly, there were some good kings. When you go up to the north, it's just about all bad kings. They really didn't have any real peaks. But here in the south, there were a few good kings. There was Uzziah. There was Hezekiah, some good men who led the nation back towards God. But Judah always had a bent to go back. And if we're just real honest with ourselves, we'd have to admit that we possess that same bent. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. What will prevent us from wandering? What will keep us on the tracks? Well, having more money. If I have more money, then life is easier, and I don't have... No, you can have all the money in the world, and it won't make your spiritual life this much better. On the other hand, you can have none of the money in the world, and your spiritual life can thrive. It's not about money. It's about our walk with God. Colossians chapter 3. We just recently went through Colossians 3. Colossians 3:2 says, "Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. For ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God." My life, because I don't have a whole lot of control over the rest of the world. Again, I can do my civic duty, but beyond that, I don't have a lot of control over the rest of the world. My life and your life, if you're a believer, should be a microcosm of the kingdom that is coming, that is prophesied in verse 14. My life should be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the water covers the sea. There's no portion of the sea that's not covered by water. And there should be no portion of my life that's not covered by the knowledge of the glory of God.